Now, our program tonight features a wonderful author of Georgia history. Born in Newberry, South Carolina, June Hall McCash's life and career have both meandered through the South. She holds degrees from both Agnes Scott and Emory University. She's written 7 books, 4 about Georgia, including the Jekyll Island Cottage Colony and Jekyll Island's early years, and numerous articles. She's appeared in 3 A&E film documentaries and on Good Morning America. She's also a frequent speaker, lecturing for the Georgia Humanities Council, various historical societies, libraries, universities, as well as the Georgia Library Association, the Jekyll Island Museum, and the Jekyll Island Club Hotel. She was on the faculty of Middle Tennessee University in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where she served as the founding director of the honors program and as the chair of the Department of Foreign Languages. June is a member of the Georgia Writers Association, as well as a board member of the Tennessee Writers Alliance. With her late husband, Bart McCash, she first visited Jekyll Island in 1983 and fell in love with it. The book that brings her here tonight, Almost Eden, is her debut novel. Set at Jekyll Island, Brunswick, and New York, and it tells the fictional story of an Irish immigrant who becomes a chambermaid at the historic Jekyll Island Club. Will you please welcome June Hall McCash?
Thank you. I appreciate that. Very nice introduction. Is this working okay? Can you hear me if I don't necessarily stand over here all the time? I try to stay behind the podium, but as an old professor, I'm not very good at it. I kind of wander around at times. I want to start by asking, how many of you have ever been to Jekyll Island? Oh my goodness. Well, that's wonderful. Almost everybody in the room. Well, I want to start out by telling you a little story that took place at Jekyll Island at the Georgia Shrimp and Grits Festival about 2 years ago. I was having dinner with a group of people we didn't know at all and 2 friends who were engaged to one another. And the young man said, he was telling these strangers about my books, and he said, "I just love June's romances." And his fiancée looked at him rather strangely and said, "Joe, she doesn't write romances." And he said, "Well, maybe not, but every time I read one of her books, I fall in love with Jekyll Island all over again." And it was, quite frankly, one of the nicest things anyone's ever said about my book. I do want to tell you about my own love story with Jekyll Island. As has already been mentioned, I went there for the first time in 1983. And stayed in one of the older motels, whose name will remain in anonymity at the moment, but it wasn't one of the most pleasant experiences I had ever had. And my husband and I left, and we were looking for coastal property to buy, and so we went down to New Smyrna Beach, Florida. And we spent the weekend in a condominium that we were seriously thinking of buying. In fact, it was the day we were going to sign the contract, and I got up that morning, fixed my coffee, and went out on the balcony, and there, driving down the beach, was an 18-wheeler. And I said, "I don't think this is the place for us." So for some reason, we went back to Jekyll Island. And at that point in time, we discovered the Historic District, and we discovered an incredible exhibit. I think it's the only time they've ever had that exhibit, which included the original club membership list. It included the original club map, which divided the island into plots that belonged to William K. Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, Joseph Pulitzer, and we are looking at these names thinking, oh my gosh, we've got to find something to read about this place. Well, we couldn't find anything but just a small little pamphlet kind of booklet thing, and my husband, who was a historian, said, "Oh, well, let's just write a book about it. We'll just knock it out in about 6 months." Right. 6 years later, we published this book together, the Jekyll Island Club, Southern Haven for America's Millionaires. It was published in 1989, and it was truly a labor of love. It took us all over the country. We traveled from Palm Beach to St. Paul, Minnesota. We went to New York, we went to Boston, we went to Chicago, anywhere you can imagine there might have been a collection from some of the people who had belonged to this club. Because when the state of Georgia took over the island in 1947, well, there were lots of piles of old papers lying around, but they wanted to clean up the place, and they brought some convicts out to the island, and they just made bonfires. And so a lot of those old papers, most of them actually, were lost, except for the ones that remained in private collection. And fortunately, the original club register, the roster, the one where people had signed in when they came to stay there, had been left during the war years in the safekeeping of Sea Island. So that was still available. In any case, we finally just said we can't live without at least having a house here. So we bought a house there. And in 1989, we published this book with the intention of doing a lot more work on Jekyll and on other southern spas of that sort. Unfortunately, my husband was diagnosed with cancer shortly thereafter, and in 1991, he passed away. And I tried really hard to keep working on these projects. The second book was going to be this one, the Jekyll Island Cottage Colony. And I really did try to work on it, but I just couldn't for many years. And so it took me another 8 years before that book, well, 7, before that book was finally published in 1998. And it's very different from the first book. The first book is the story of the club itself. The second book is the story of each of the historic cottages on the island and the families who lived in them and their relationship with the island. Well, you know how people who write history are. They always will know a little bit more. And of course, I wasn't actually a historian. As you've already mentioned, I was in foreign languages. That was my discipline. And so I was also doing research on medieval French literature at the time. And I did, in between all these, I published 3 books about medieval French literature. But I wanted to know much more about Jekyll Island's early years. And so I started a new project. And finally, in 2005, the third book, this one, was published, all these by the University of Georgia Press, and it covers the period from prehistory, when the Native Americans still used the island for hunting and for their own settlements and that sort of thing, up through Reconstruction. And I ended at the point that the Jekyll Island Club is being founded. Well, that obviously leaves one more period that's I still haven't written about. And I really hadn't planned to, but I have a son who is a historian. His name is Bryn Martin, and he and I together did an article for a book that was published by the University of Alabama Press on the state era of Jekyll Island. And he would like us to develop that into a book. It's a fascinating story. Georgia political history at its most colorful, to say the least. But interestingly enough, it's another possibility that would kind of wind up, I guess, my Jekyll tetralogy or whatever. This is my trilogy, so we may go one more, but it will be, if I do it, it won't be by me. It'll be with my son, or perhaps I'm trying to talk him into doing it on his own, but I'm not. He wants to work with me, so we may do that. Well, that brings me to the present book. And people say, well, how do you stop doing all that research and just start making it up? Well, I didn't exactly do that. I built on that research. I milked that research for everything it was worth in the novel. And I think some of you have copies of it, and it's outside. Oh yes, here it is. This is what it looks like. This is the hardcover edition. I see they didn't order any of these, but it is available in both soft and hardcover if you're at all interested. It's called Almost to Eden. And it was not the book about the Georgia coast, the novel, I first started to write. My first intended publication in terms of the novel was going to be called Plum Orchard. Well, I have remarried since my previous husband died, and my present husband said, that's a good book, but he said, he knew I was working on this one as well. He said, I think this is the first one you need to do. And I thought about it a while, and finally, I thought he was right, so I did. And people say, well, you know, you just get to make it all up. No, you don't make it up. You may embellish some of the history, you may create characters, but the history remains the same. And those of you who know the history of Jekyll Island, I think will find much in this book that's based on the historical information that I have gathered over the years. It takes place in a period from 1911 to 1969. And it involves a woman named Maggie O'Brien who comes to America in 1911 as an Irish immigrant with every intention of living out all her dreams. America is going to be a new Eden. It's going to be that perfect place that sometimes you don't find in the old country. And so Maggie came to America, and in many respects, it was what she thought, and in many other respects, it was not. And almost anyone who seeks Eden or who seeks perfection in this world is going to be disappointed at some point. I think one of the things that surprised me most about this book, and by the way, it's definitely not a romance, and I want to say that up front because what I'm going to say kind of builds on that. I think the things that surprised me most has been the reaction of my male readers. I expected female readers to relate to the character, to really enjoy the ways in which she copes with the adventures she experiences in life. But I think the thing that has surprised me most is how many letters I've gotten from male readers. And in fact, I wasn't even thinking about it at the time, but when I asked people to write the little blurbs on the back, I inadvertently asked 3 men. I actually had a 4th who was a woman, but she didn't get it in time, so it didn't appear. But I did know one of these people well. You don't have that blurb, but in the hardcover, there is a comment by Rick Hutto, who was the author of The Gilded Cage, which is a book also about Jekyll. But the other 2 authors, one is Brian J. Corrigan. They're both Georgia writers. The other is Stephen Doster. And I had met both of these men one time. But they were both Georgia writers, and I thought, well, maybe they would be willing to comment. And I was really bowled over by their response to the book. And I thought, okay, well, they're writing blurbs. They're supposed to say something nice about it, right? But I have received dozens of letters from male readers saying, I could not put it down. I really related to that character. I wanted things to come out well. The dean of one of the deans at my university bought a copy a week or 2 ago, and he called me the other day, and he said, you know, I was expecting chick lit. And I said, from me? You were expecting chick lit from me? He said, well, you know, I assumed it was going to be all, you know, womanly, and it was all going to come out great in the end, and everybody was going to live happily ever after. And he said, I was just amazed. He said, it wasn't like that at all. And I said, well, it came out okay, you know, they wound it. Well, yes, but it wasn't what he anticipated. And so I've been very, very pleased by the fact that they have accepted it as I intended it, as a literary novel, and certainly not as a romance. That's not to say there's not a love story in it. There is. But it's not the primary focus of the book. The primary focus is really that relationship between a mother and a son. But it is a book, I think, that above all reflects my own love of Jekyll Island and my own romance with Jekyll Island. I want to read you a few passages, if that's okay. That'd be okay? I've got 4 rather short passages, and if I go on too long, and you will, I'm sure, stop me. The first one is the very beginning, and it's Maggie's arrival in America, in which she wants to have these dreams fulfilled. She's like all immigrants. 9 September 1911. There it is, I see it. The breathless cry came from a tow-headed boy perched on his father's shoulders. Hands clenched tight beneath his father's chin, he bounced with exuberance as he pointed toward the west. The man gripped the deck rail with one hand and held firmly to the boy's legs with the other as he strained to make out the speck on the horizon. "There it is," the boy cried again, louder this time. A cheer went up from the passengers, who rushed toward the rail to peer into the afternoon sun, their faces shining in the reflected light. They had waited many days for this sight, the Lady Liberty. They were here at last, on the verge of this land where they felt sure all their dreams would come true. Maggie stood on tiptoe, stretching her 5'2" frame in an effort to see over the heads of other passengers. Her heart pounded with excitement and apprehension, banishing the queasiness she had felt ever since they had left Queenstown on the Irish coast more than a week ago. She didn't know what to expect upon landing. She'd sent her cousin Eleanor the date of her arrival and the name of her ship, the SS Arabic, and trusted her cousin would meet her at the dock, for she had no idea what to do or where to go on her own. The idea of a big city in a strange land was terrifying, as she'd never been any place larger than Galway. Maggie loved her steamship's name. It made her think of a magic carpet, carrying her to places she'd only dreamed about, though it certainly didn't look much like a magic carpet, with its 4 masts and enormous smokestack belching thick gray smoke. For those in steerage like herself, cabins were crowded, and the bunks were hard and uncomfortable. After the first few days, the public areas took on a pungent smell of vomit and body odor, disguised with antiseptic. But nobody seemed to mind. They were on their way to America, the whole eager lot of them. Like the rest of the passengers, she was awed by the tall, bronze statue of the broad-shouldered woman, a book held against her body with her left hand, and in her right, the torch of freedom. In the distance toward the right, Maggie could see the island of Manhattan, but the Arabic veered left instead, toward the Hudson River Pier. It was there the sailors told them that they would be allowed to debark at dawn and wait for ferries that would take them to their final point of immigration, a red brick building with 4 ornate turrets and white limestone tracings that made it look like a palace, the magic gateway to America, Ellis Island. Well, you might not realize how much research goes into a small passage like that, but I did a lot of research on the SS Arabic and on how immigrants come into New York and where they went first and how long it took and that sort of thing. The SS Arabic, incidentally, was the first ocean liner that was sunk in World War I. And there are some interesting stories about it, although one of the things you can't do as a novelist is tell everything you know. And you really shouldn't do that as a nonfiction writer either. You have to know so much more than you can possibly put into the book. But it's important, I think, to have that depth of knowledge and that depth of understanding. The second passage I want to read, and you will tell me when I need to stop. I have actually 4 short passages, so if that's too much. The second passage deals with Maggie's coming to Jekyll Island. I won't tell you how she got the job or any of that sort of thing, but she's approaching Jekyll Island. She's already been through Brunswick. The club launch, its name Jekyll Island painted on the bow, was waiting for them at the dock. The captain stood beside the gangplank to help them aboard. Bales of Sea Island cotton, ready for shipment, dotted the wharf at the deep water port, and 2 little boys, dark as midnight, sat atop one of the bales, dangling their legs over the sides and watching with curiosity the workers boarding the vessel that would take them to their final destination. As each passenger crossed the gangway, the captain touched the brim of his hat and said, "Captain James Clark, at your service." It made Maggie feel like one of the Vanderbilts, who she had been told sometimes came to the island. Even the short delay as the launch stood in port, waiting for everyone to board, was delicious. The harbor was tranquil and quaint after the noisy, teeming docks of New York 3 days earlier. Maggie drank in the beauty of the place they had left behind. They had left behind snow and icy winds that would freeze her ears should she dare to venture outside without a scarf or hat. Here the sun shone warm on her face, and she closed her eyes and felt its rays soak into her. Finally, they were underway. The excitement was contagious, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a renewed sense of adventure. The waiters in their ill-fitting suits grinned and joked as they held onto their fashionable derby hats. while the chambermaids clutched their cloaks or shawls around them a bit tighter as they moved into the breezes of the cooler, open water. I'm going to skip a little bit here and move on. A young man approaches her, and he's telling her about the marshes and about the poem by Sidney Lanier called The Marshes of Glen. And he decides he's going to quote some of this for her. He said, "My favorite lines are, 'Sometimes my soul seems suddenly free from the weighing of fate and the sad discussion of sin by the length and the breadth and the sweep of the marshes of Glen.'" "Oh, that's beautiful," Maggie smiled at his overly dramatic recitation. "The poem is really about the greatness of God, but I like the part about being free from the sad discussion of sin. That's how I feel here," Bert said, basking in his authority. It was easy to understand why the poet had been so taken with the marshes and why they would make him contemplate God's greatness. They gave Maggie the same feeling she used to have standing on the edge of the cliffs of Moore, looking out over the vastness of the sea, where the marshes stretched to the horizon, the cordgrass swaying gently back and forth in the rising tide as their boat swept by. At the water's edge, a snowy egret high-stepped through the shallow waters along the bank, peering beneath the dark surface for his breakfast. Maggie pointed out the egret to Deidre, and together they marveled at the soaring gray pelicans and the blue herons flying over the waters that sparkled like multifaceted diamonds. The marsh grasses stretched for miles or so even in height, they looked as though they had been trimmed by some divine gardener and trained to stop just at the water's edge. Maggie felt her anxieties drain away as the little vessel sliced its way through the water toward Jekyll. The island lay before them, a solid mass of green, looking as though it were uninhabited. A dark-haired man the waiters called Hector the Greek was staring across the glittering marshes at the same snowy egret that first caught Maggie's eye. He watched its jerky mechanical motions with amusement. It looked as though it were being manipulated by the strings of a puppeteer, but it was not the bird that really held his interest. He had been watching the pair of young women ever since they had left New York, trying to get up the nerve to strike up a conversation with the one whose wide blue eyes were shining as she pointed to the bird. His new pal, George Harvey, who, like Hector, had been hired as a clubhouse waiter, goaded him on in his strong Liverpool accent. "Hey, give it a go, old boy. She won't bite, you know." But Hector held back. He was not usually so reticent. He knew that women found him attractive, though for the life of him he couldn't figure out why. He could not see the fire in his own dark eyes that drew women like moths to a candle. He just enjoyed the results. This woman, however, was different. A sad cast about her eyes, even when they sparkled with excitement, seemed incongruous with her fresh scrubbed innocence. When their glances had met all too briefly one day in the steamer dining room, the gaze of her large eyes was steady. She'd smiled in a friendly, disarming manner, as she might have smiled at a fond cousin, then turned away and went on with her conversation with the blonde, braided woman seated next to her. She seemed completely unaware that in that tiny moment, that split second it took for their eyes to meet, he had fallen off the edge of the world. The third passage I want to read takes place in New York City and during the period of World War II. And it involves, a lot has happened to Maggie in the meantime. But she has come to a hospital in New York to read to wounded soldiers. 28 August 1918. On a sweltering summer afternoon, Maggie sat beside the bed of a young man with bandaged eyes in one of the wards at Bellevue. His name was Wilbur Fendig, and he had been blinded in the battle on the banks of the Marne River when slivers of shrapnel from an exploding shell pierced both his eyes and took off his left ear. He was an emotional wreck. Though he could hear with his remaining ear, he was sure that he would never be of use to anyone again. Maggie read him letters from home, from his mother, his sister, and a woman named Gladys, who wrote every single day and promised to love him always, no matter what. But Wilbur only turned his face to the wall when he heard these proclamations. Maggie longed to comfort him, but he seemed beyond her reach. All she could do was come twice a week to read to him. She read Mark Twain, which he seemed to enjoy, and sometimes she read from the Psalms, though she had to be careful which ones she chose. Nothing about lifting up one's eyes unto the hills or seeing the light. Wilbur seemed to like the 46th Psalm, which began, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. He seemed especially to respond to the verse that promised, He maketh wars to cease unto the ends of the earth. But he had not made Wilbur's war end, and Maggie knew that his battle within was perhaps his greatest struggle. She tried to talk with him about people with afflictions who had done wonderful things. Her father had told her that the poet Homer was blind, and she had read somewhere that John Milton was blind when he wrote Paradise Lost, and that Beethoven was deaf when he wrote his greatest symphony. She tried to share their gifts to the world with Wilbur, but he was a country boy from Tennessee, and he had never heard of any of them except Beethoven, and he told her he didn't plan to write music anyway. He just wanted to go back home and farm, and who ever heard of a blind farmer? Finally, she just read to him, for it seemed to calm his spirit more than anything else. A few days later, as Maggie sat silently beside Wilbur's bed, realizing that he had fallen asleep as she read, a nurse named Sharon Pickens came over and spoke to her. Maggie, there's a soldier on the sun porch that I'd like you to speak to. He saw you come in and asked about you. I told him I'd have you stop by. I'll be happy to, Sharon. Just point him out. I think Private Fendig is weary from my readings anyhow, but if he wakes up and asks about me, tell him I'll be back on Wednesday to finish the story. Maggie rose and followed Nurse Pickens out to the sun porch, where 6 or 8 young men, some still in their teens, sat in wheelchairs. Some of them had bandaged heads, others arms in casts or legs propped out in front of them, gazing at the greenery outside, playing cards or reading. Sergeant O'Neill, here's Miss O'Brien to speak with you, the nurse said, leaning over the shoulder of a man whose head had slumped forward and whose left arm was missing below the elbow. The stump was swathed in white bandages that had been recently changed, and the upper part of his left leg and groin area were bandaged as well. The man swiveled in his wheelchair with his good arm. Maggie, is it really you? He said, an uncertain smile breaking across his face. Stuart O'Neill, I can't believe it. She bent toward him and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. Then she turned back to Nurse Pickens. Thank you, Sharon. Stuart and I are old friends. The nurse nodded and pushed forward a chair that was lined up against the wall so that Maggie could sit down. I never thought I'd see you again, Maggie, though I looked everywhere. You just disappeared, and I never knew why. But here I am again, and so glad to see you alive. You've been in the war, I see. She gestured toward his amputated arm. Are you going to be all right? As all right as a one-armed man can be, I guess. At least it was my left arm. I can still direct traffic if they'll let me back on the force this way. I wish this dreadful war were over, she said. A lot of it wished it had never begun. But you volunteered. Yes, he said. I thought I might be able to help. But this happened in my second battle at the Marne, and they sent me home. So I didn't get to help much. He smiled with only a slight twinge of bitterness. Enough to become a sergeant, evidently. Maggie smiled encouragingly. Field promotion after so many officers in my platoon were killed. A lot of them didn't make it back, and a lot of others are worse off than me. I see you've been reading to Private Fendig. He's one I'm truly worried about. So am I, Stuart. He seems to have a girl back home who cares about him, but he won't even answer her letters. He's luckier than I am to have a girl back home, I mean. He hesitated for a moment before asking quietly, why did you run away, Maggie? I'm very conscious of time, and I do have one more passage which really isn't very long, if it's okay. And it's based on my own first glimpse of the Jekyll Island Club, my own first experience there. So a lot of the work in this book is from my imagination. And at the end, there is an author's note at the end that tells you which parts are fictional and which parts are historical. Quite a bit of it is historical, and a lot of it's fictional as well. But a lot of it is also based on my own personal experience. You would never know it, but members of my family will pick up on many things, dates and names and so forth, that have sneaked into the book. that are definitely personal recollections. This involves a couple you haven't met yet. Their names are Danny and Jill, and they have come to Jekyll Island, and they don't know their way around. There's something they're trying to find. I won't tell you what it is, but they also want a place to stay. And they've gone to a little store called Maxwell's. I'm sure many of you know that store. And they've gotten directions. And he says, "Thanks. And are there any hotels or motels on the island? I think I once read something about the old Jekyll Island Club being a hotel now. Used to be. But it's closed down now. You'll pass it if you go back toward the causeway and turn right. But there's plenty of motels. Turn left on Beachview and you'll find the Wanderer a mile or so down the road on the right. Some others down toward the south end. One of them's the Buccaneer," she said, motioning in the opposite direction. "You can't miss them." She chuckled now, and her eyes began to sparkle with humor. "It's pretty hard to get lost on Jekyll. I'm sure we'll find them. Thanks again." He backed the car out of the parking place and turned it toward the causeway. "Guess what?" he said to Jill. "The old clubhouse is still here, but it's closed now. Why don't we go take a look?" Once they had turned north onto Riverview Road, they came quickly to a series of once grand old houses. "Wonder who lives in these? Some pretty neat architecture, don't you think?" Daniel asked, slowing as he drove by. In front of one was a sign proclaiming it the Rockefeller Museum. Then up ahead he saw what must be the clubhouse. The white tower they had seen from the causeway stood at the south end. The structure was an old frame Queen Anne-style building with whimsical balconies and porches. To the right of the clubhouse, they could see another large gray building that also appeared deserted. Daniel turned into the driveway and parked the car. "Wow," he said, "too bad it's closed. Want to see if we can find a way in?" "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Jill was already climbing out of the car. They mounted the front steps of the building to the wide, curved porch. It appeared still sturdy, but Daniel could see that in places the wood was beginning to rot and the paint was peeling. The wooden facade of the clubhouse looked neglected and ghostly in the afternoon light. The heavy front door was locked, but Daniel found a window partially opened. Pushing it up farther, he climbed through and stepped into a parlor. Moving on into the hallway, he called Jill, who was climbing in through the window. "Take a look at this." She followed him into the wide hall where a magnificent row of huge mirrors on each side reflected their image 100 times or more as far as they could see. Looks like they were trying to compete with Versailles," he said. They reached what was once the lobby. They could detect beneath the scattered rubbish and tawdry modernization that had obviously been attempted what was once a fine old clubhouse. An elevator shaft had been installed where there had probably once been a grand staircase when the club was new. Ahead of them, they saw what they thought must have been the dining room, stacked in the middle with old wicker furniture. The walls were painted a garish pink, and a water leak had caused one part of the ceiling to sag. In spite of its condition, the former elegance of the room was evident from the large fireplace at one end and the 8 Ionic columns that supported the ceiling, which was bordered by a graceful frieze. "So this is where my father worked. In this very room," Daniel said, reaching out for Jill's hand. "It must have been quite splendid then," she answered. "Should we find a way to go upstairs? The upper floors don't look too reliable." He pointed to the sagging ceiling, "And I don't see a staircase. The elevator won't work because there's no electricity." The light was fading, and Daniel caught sight of the setting sun through one of the large windows of the dining room. "Let's go back outside and watch the sunset." They'd never seen anything like it. The entire horizon was bright orange, but already in the upper regions the color was fading to a pinkish purple. They sat on the clubhouse steps to watch as the great ball of sun began to sink behind the marshes. The river that ran in front of the clubhouse was aflame with the molten reflection. "You know," he said, squeezing his wife's hand, "one could be happy in such a place." She laid her head on his shoulders. "Yes," she murmured, "I know." Well, how many of you have seen those sunsets at Jekyll Island? If you come from New York and that's your very first one, it must be quite spectacular. I just came from New York last week, and believe me, I saw nothing like it there. No matter how hard you peer on the Upper West Side, you just don't get sunsets like you get on Jekyll. Well, I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone would like to ask any. Actually, Maggie is my own invention. She is not the only one in this story, but she is the primary invention. And what started me off on this particular book was the need to give life to someone whose life we know nothing really about. I think what got me started in this particular book, I went to the little Jekyll Island Cemetery, and I'm sure many of you have done that as well. And there are those lovely tombs in the cemetery that belong to members of the Dubignon family, or the Dubignon family, as we call it today. And tucked in the back, there are 3 of those big, magnificent, lovely tombs have gotten broken, but they've been recently cleaned, and I'm hoping will be soon repaired. But in the back are tucked away 2 little tombstones. And I had to know who those people were. I asked people, no one seemed to know. At least not the people I asked. So, being Snoopy type, I knew the day they died because it was on the tombstone. So of course I got the newspapers, the Brunswick News, which has been a wonderful resource for me, and looked at the following day's news and found the answer. So that's what kind of got it started. And it was ordered to give life to one of those people, really to both of them, that Maggie was created. So, a memorable book signing experience. Wow. Well, I guess the most memorable one I've had was probably the first one I did for this book. I assume you're referring to this book, because I've had many over the years. But, well, there were just so many people, and it was launched at the Jekyll Island Club Hotel and sponsored by the Friends of Historic Jekyll Island and by the Jekyll Island Club, by the Jekyll Island Museum, and by the clubhouse. So there were quite a few people there, and their wonderful thing is they always, everyone thinks I know them when I've probably met them once, 7 years ago, and I just don't always remember. But I had asked everyone to write down their name, because I once spelled Mary Smith wrong. She said, would you please sign it to Mary Smith? And I wrote it the way you probably would write Mary Smith, and I got through, and she said, I spell it S-M-Y-T-H-E. And I said, well, from that point on, I said, would you please write down how you spell your name so that I can know? But there was one delightful woman whom I've seen many times, but when you've got 50 people standing there, you think, I'm not sure I can remember every single one. And she said, she handed me the book, and she said, you know me? And I said, yes, I do, but I couldn't remember her husband's name to save my life, and she wanted it autographed to both of them. So that happens a lot, that kind of thing. I've also had people who'd come up and say, well, my grandmother was in your book. I had one once who was looking at, I don't know if it's still on here or not. No, they've changed the cover on this one. But on the back of the original edition, there are some members of the Rockefeller family on a picnic on the beach. And one of them came up and said, my grandmother's in that picture. And I said, oh, that's great. But you get so much of that, people who have their own memories. And I'm sure you must have wonderful memories of Jekyll Island as well. It's a very, very special place. And for me, it's had the same kind of magic for me that it had for Maggie and for so many of the other people who moved through the book. This was very much, what you heard at the end with Danny and Jill, was very much like my own first experience at Jekyll when we found the historic district. The first time we didn't even know it was there. And so when we came back and found it, we went out. I didn't go inside the clubhouse because I got a tour through the clubhouse. One of the museum curators took us through, but there was an open window at the Sans Souci, and so I did crawl in, and I'm really glad I did, because later, when 2 or 3 years later, when they restored the clubhouse, they took all those apartments and split them all up into hotel rooms, and I was so glad I had gotten to see one intact. My personal belief was they should have at least kept J.P. Morgan's apartment and used it as a great honeymoon suite. I mean, wouldn't it be neat to spend your honeymoon in J.P. Morgan's Sans Souci apartment? But they didn't, and I think they've done a wonderful restoration job. I'm very pleased. I have become good friends with Larry Evans and Vance Hughes, who did the restoration, and I really admire their work and their dedication for having restored that beautiful clubhouse and brought it back to life. When I first went there was discussion of tearing it down, as they had done just a few years earlier with the Oglethorpe Hotel in Brunswick, which was very, very similar in many respects. So I was just so thrilled to know that they were doing that. Actually, the museum is responsible for keeping the houses up. The Jekyll Island Foundation is a fundraising group that does special projects, and our first project was the Sea Turtle Center. We've raised the money and built the Sea Turtle Center. I'm now on the advisory board. I was on the board for 9 years, and they expanded the limits twice, so we couldn't do that again. I mean, that would just not have worked. So I am still on the advisory board, and one of the projects that they're working on now is, or at least discussing, is trying to do some restoration work on Hollybourne. They will never be able really to restore Hollybourne because it's an immensely difficult project. But what they're hoping to do is turn it into a kind of a workshop for historic preservation students, and little by little allow them to work on the project, and little by little begin to do some restoration there. Another one is working in conjunction with the hotel to, while the new convention center is being built, to use the Morgan tennis courts for some of the events there. And so that is being redone. And the Jekyll Island Foundation is participating in some of these projects now. You know, ever since Jekyll Island was taken over by the state of Georgia, it has been a controversial issue. And I think it probably always will be. I think it's a treasure. I really like the notion of Georgia's jewel. I really think it's an extraordinary place. If you look at the coast of Georgia, you have 4 important and more than that actually, 5 or 6 I think you could say, but different forms of tourism, okay? You have St. Simon's, which is privately owned and developing helter-skelter. You have Cumberland, which is now a national seashore. You have Sapelo, which is, again, private, but still controlled by the state of Georgia. And then you have Jekyll, which is the only island, and then you have Sea Island, of course, which I don't go there because, I've been there several times, but I could not afford a house there. And frankly, it wouldn't be my choice if I could, because I really like Jekyll was built, as the first governor, M.E. Thompson, said, for the plain people of Georgia. And I kind of fit more in that category, you know. But I think that Jekyll's going to go through some interesting transitional years. I think that this revitalization has been, have you been to the new motel, the New Hampton Inn that's built there? It's been beautifully done and is quite environmentally sensitive. I mean, it's a, what do they call it, a Leeds building for the environmentalists. And I think all the motels that are going to be built or restored and all the building there is going to meet those standards from now on. I think that's a very good thing. But I think that the controversies probably are not over. They probably never will be as long as Jekyll is there. Because you have a combination of entrepreneurial folks out there and state ownership, and people who own houses but don't own the land they own, and that kind of thing. So it's, you know, it's rocky at times. But I think it's worth rocking a little bit to keep it. I think it's a real special place. Actually, the Federal Reserve wasn't really founded there. What they did there was to draft what was known as the Aldrich Plan. And it failed in Congress because the wrong party was in power at that particular time for that particular proposal. But when that party came back into power, most of the statutes, most of the ideas that were in the Aldrich Plan were later adopted into the Federal Reserve. So I think one can say from that point of view that it definitely was a very important meeting. I think that was important. I think the first transcontinental call that was made from Jekyll Island was extremely important as well. I mean, that opened so many new doors for people throughout the country. And so certainly both of those were critical issues. Had the Federal Reserve, ideas of the Federal Reserve not been floated there, they would have been floated somewhere else. But that was just a very private place where Senator Aldrich could bring the folks. Well, I think that's wonderful. I think it's really wonderful because basically the ideas were drafted there. But the Aldrich plan was what literally came out of that particular meeting. And I think what became the Federal Reserve System was born, at least as an embryo, certainly at Jekyll Island. Yeah. That's interesting. Is it a big, I've forgotten the year, but is it a big anniversary or something coming up?
Yeah, and it's going to be,
Okay, well that's wonderful. Yeah.
there's going to be big names, lots of traffic.
Okay, well if they need a speaker. Oh my, well I've been inspired by so many writers, it's really hard to say. I love people like Barbara Kingsolver and as a novelist, you know, and I'm not a reader of romance or those kinds of things. I like something with a lot of meat in it. And of course, I've been inspired by a lot of French authors, too, people like Flaubert and even Marcel Proust, if you will. I try to write shorter sentences than he did, but I really enjoy those writers. Edith Wharton, Henry James. I love so many writers, it's hard to say. I also enjoy Pat Conroy's work. And Ann Rivers Siddons, who's an Atlanta writer, I believe. Pat Conroy, I have to tell you a Pat Conroy story, if you give me 30 seconds. I had read Pat Conroy's, I don't know if it's now his most recent book, but it was at the time, and it was called My Losing Season. I don't know if any of you have read that or not. But I was really bowled over by that book. I've read a lot of his other books, and I enjoy them, but this one seemed to me a very personal statement about becoming a writer and about becoming Pat Conroy. And so I'm very bad about not writing letters to people whom I admire. I'm going to get better at it, I promise. But I wrote him a letter, and I said, I really enjoyed this book. And I told him all the reasons why. And about 3 days later, he called me. And I was at Jekyll Island at the time, and we must have talked for 20 minutes. But he said, you know, I had the hardest time getting that book published of any book I've ever done. And I said, why? Because it was so wonderful. He said, well, my agent said nobody wants to read a book about basketball. And I said, but it wasn't really about basketball. He said, yeah, I know that, you know that. But she didn't quite figure that out at the beginning. But evidently, he hadn't gotten as many letters about that book as he got about the others. So I really appreciated that call. So of course I have to like his work too.
So what's your best advice from writers?
My best advice from writers is write, rewrite, and don't give up. If you're asking my advice to beginning writers or to people just starting out as writers, I think too often we get turned off by the process, turned away by the process. It's very difficult to find agents. It's very difficult to find publishers. But there is always somebody out there that, if your work is good, I mean, I'm not saying that if it's not, but if you're willing to listen to others and willing to take criticism in a constructive way, I am one of those people. I used to write these I retired several years ago and started writing full time, but before that, I wrote scholarly articles for medieval journals, and I would get back these things, and they would say, well, we really like this, we want to publish it, but we want you to do this, 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 and this to it. And I would go through fuming for a day or two. How, you know, what do they know? How could they? And then I would settle down and really think about what they said and think, you know, that's a good idea. And I would do it, and it was infinitely stronger article as a consequence. And I think too often young writers get intimidated by criticism. Listen to what the other person is saying. Remember, it's only one person's opinion, and ultimately the decision is yours. But if you are going to ask people to read them, I think you have to expect them to give you feedback. If you don't want feedback, don't ask them. But then give serious consideration to what they say. I think that you can learn a lot from other people. I know I have anyway. 2 more questions, and he says I have to stop. Yes, sir. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, I did go there. And if you've never been to Ellis Island, it is an experience you will never forget. It was really, I couldn't have written that had I not gone there. And of course, there's a lot more in the description. I just read the very beginning, before they even got onto Ellis Island. But again, I think research is different when you're writing fiction. You have to have the scholarly research too. But at the same time, I think you need very much to have that kind of personal interaction with place and with character, which for me is really critical in any case.
She came over with her sister, and they were afraid to take her brother because he was sick, and they knew that to get to Ellis Island, they would send him back.
And I have one person in the book to whom that happens. So it's yeah, you never know, and they would not admit you to the United States if you had certain illnesses, and so they were wise not to bring their brother, for sure. Anybody else? Ken?
Did you write the book on Jekyll Island?
To a very great extent, I did. I did a lot of rewriting back in Tennessee. I did a lot of writing just about everywhere I was because I carry my little laptop with me, and I must write every chapter 15, 20, 25 times before I'm happy with it. And sometimes I'm still not happy with it. You just finally have to let it go. You know how that is. I mean, you cannot always... There's a character in a Camus novel. And Johnny, you might remember this one. He's a character in a book that Camus wrote called The Plague, La Peste. And he's a writer, and he wants to record the things that are going on in this plague. And he rewrites the first sentence over and over and over and over until he wants it to be perfect. Perfection is for God, is all I can say. You finally have to let it go. And that's what I finally had to do here. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.